So this is the final session for today, and I'm going to invite up the Heritage Council of WA Chair Darren Foster to say a few words and provide some reflection, and then you'll hear back from me for just a short while before we wrap up for the day. Thanks, folks.
Thank you. What an amazing conference. We need one a month, I think, until 2029. There's so many amazing ideas out there. Look, I just want to acknowledge at the beginning the welcome that we had from Robyn Collard, which I thought was very special, and her grandson, Therese Rioli. Great to see that transmission of culture and heritage from one generation to another in that particular case. And I spoke to them outside because I obviously recognise the Rioli name, who doesn't, and discovered that Therese's great-grandmother lived in the Tiwi Islands, and in the late 90s I took my sons to the Tiwi Islands, so they had an experience of being in a community where they were the minority. So they were had snowy white hair, little pale-skinned boys, living in the Tiwi Islands for a little while. It was just a long holiday, and Therese's great-grandmother taught my sons the crocodile song, which they still play in our swimming pool from time to time. So, you know, there's that transmission of culture and all those sort of intersections we have with one another. Steve, is Steve still here? Yes, sorry. What an awesome keynote, and obviously, you know, I think very close to many of our hearts in terms of the, you know, the intersection and the interrelationships between all of the various disciplines, and how balmy it is that we try and segment human experience in the way that we do. And it really hits home with me because last year I went to the Budgebim World Heritage Area and had a tour with a Gorditj Mara elder who showed me around. He happens to be my brother-in-law, and he showed me where his ancestor hid from the, his Aboriginal ancestor hid from the police trying to round them up to take them to the Lake Condah mission. They hid in the caves in the Budgebim World Heritage Area, which you know, was important cultural knowledge that it was a safe place. There are so many caves that you'd never find anyone, and it has you know, many of them have fresh water sources, so it was actually a good place to hide. They also knew that the horses of the police could not get across the rocky ground that was created by lava flows several thousand years ago. So again, that cultural knowledge became quite important in terms of staying out of the range of the troopers. And of course, you know, in the 1960s, this area also is where the Lake Condah mission is, where many people, including my brother-in-law's ancestors, were put into the mission. The Lake Condah is now a third of its original size because the Graziers in the 60s blew up with dynamite the volcanic plug that kept the lake the size it was, which was, of course, then it was a huge food source for many Aboriginal people. So they reduced the food source by a third, affected the migratory bird species that inhabited the area and came from, you know, very far afield to that location. So that, in my mind, is a good example of how there's a real intersection between place, you know, the Lake Condah mission, which would be the kind of place that we could put on our heritage list because it fits the narrow definition we've got in our Act, but we wouldn't be telling the stories of the lava flow, you know, the aquaculture that was practiced by the Aboriginal people for several thousand years in that location. You know, how Susanna hid in the caves with her children to escape the police. Those are all interesting stories that intersect. So it just sort of illustrates, I think, in my mind, how you cannot separate, you know, human experience, whether Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, and place, because all are a reaction and response to the place, and we all have different knowledge we bring to that place. So there's a bunch of stories there. We're very acutely aware at the Heritage Council of the limitations of the Act that we have. It was born of its era, and having been a public servant for most of my life, I know how these pieces of legislation are created. It's often the subject of compromise late at night in the upper house of Parliament with lots of red wine flowing. So you can't look at legislation as perfection. You've got to look at it as an artefact of its time, a cultural manifestation of its time, of prevailing attitudes at that particular time. And I think you've got to also learn to not treat legislation as a straitjacket. Now, that will be heresy to my colleagues in the State Solicitor's Office, but I always look at a piece of legislation and think, if it doesn't forbid you, then you can do it. That wouldn't go down very well in the State Solicitor's Office, but you've got to look at the situation we have. We have an Environmental Protection Act that dates from 1971, so there was a little window of progressive mood in WA that got that piece of legislation through about the same time as the US set up their own EPA. So it was a really significant piece of legislation, and it endures. It's had multiple amendments. In 1972, the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act went through, and again, stars aligned for that to occur. And that was about protection of Aboriginal places and objects. So you could see that sort of anthropological feel to that piece of legislation. The other critical factor was Frank Gare was the Commissioner for Native Welfare at the time, who subsequently became I can't remember what his subsequent title was, but he was the head of the Aboriginal Affairs Planning Authority, as I think it was called. But he was the last Commissioner of Native Welfare. He was a progressive. He came from a Quaker background. The opposite of A.O. Neville, who was the Neville the Devil, who destroyed a lot of Aboriginal families in the previous generations. So Frank Ellis Gare, a fabulous human being, really worked hard to assist and empower Aboriginal people, and was doing that not just through his day job, but through some of his extracurricular activities with his activist wife, Neen Gare. And in the late 90s, I spent many hours with Frank interviewing him for an oral history project, and hours of that tape is now in the State Library. And he is one of the sort of, I think, a very quiet and understated individual, but he was a very influential and significant public servant that made a very big difference and managed to get that piece of legislation through. Ironically, the Heritage Act didn't get through until 1990, which is about 15 years after Victoria had legislation. And it's interesting to reflect on why that's the case. And I worked for the First Minister of Heritage in WA at the time, and she got it through the Parliament. She was quite a canny negotiator in the upper house, and I'm sure a lot of red wine was involved as well. There'd been multiple attempts to get that Act through that had failed, and it had failed because the legislation was seen as a threat to private property owners. So, interesting, the other two pieces of legislation got through in this sort of window of time, but then heritage just didn't quite make it. So we've only had heritage laws in WA for 35 years. But again, in that spirit of not seeing a piece of legislation as a straitjacket, and as I said, we're very aware of some of the issues we've got with the Act, because one of the requirements of the Act is you've got to geolocate a place if you're going to put it on the list, which means we have to have a red line on a map. And that doesn't make a lot of sense for intangible heritage. And there's a practical effect of having red lines on the map, and that is anyone who does anything within those red lines has to refer into the Heritage Council, and then there's a lot of red tape and a lot of process around it, which may not achieve any particular useful outcome. So we're trying to sort of adapt and work with some of those constraints and be a bit creative, if I can put it that way, without alarming State Solicitor's Office. And we're deliberately, it's no accident this is a joint Heritage Council and Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Committee conference. That's quite a conscious choice on our part, because we don't see great sense in these two pieces of legislation standing apart, or nor Environmental Protection Act for that matter. And so we're very keen to focus on the storytelling and the place and the listings and the red lines are sort of secondary. And you can't tell the stories without including Aboriginal stories front and centre, and the interaction with the early colonists and the consequences of that. And we've got to think very carefully, and we have at the Heritage Council, about who we've traditionally left out of our heritage listings and our considerations, and we've recognised that a lot of non-English speaking migrants don't get much of a look in. Women, workers, Aboriginal people and places don't get much of a look in on our register. So we're very, very consciously focusing on those groups. And what that means is we've got to be very resistant to the pressure that inevitably comes our way from interest groups and others who raise, well, there's this other building that we really like and it's about to be bulldozed. You know, I don't want to mention Outram Street, but that's a good example. It's a lovely building and it's just horrific to see that that might not have a future, but it's not on the heritage list. And if we drop our tools and then go and focus on that, again, those forgotten groups get missed out. Last week I went with my son to a function at the old courthouse in Fremantle. I'd never been there before. It was to see an author doing a presentation. And as I got in there, it dawned on me that this was the courthouse where my grandfather was committed to state care in 1897. That was the location of the course of my family's history changing. He was committed to state care. He never saw his mother again. I turned and looked on the wall, and there is a huge portrait of the resident magistrate, Robert Fairbairn, who was the presiding magistrate that made the decision to commit my grandfather to state care. Nowhere in that place was anything about the people, the thousands of people like my grandfather and other, neglected children, the petty criminals, the prostitutes, the underclass who would have gone through that courthouse over decades. So they're kind of airbrushed out of history very easily. And I think we've all got to work to try and sort of draw out those interesting stories. That was a bit of an electric moment for me, being in that place with my son, who is named after my grandfather. And that brings me to the topic of young people and also the technology that I think you've all seen today that people have lent into. The technology that is drawing out the stories and overcoming some of the artificial barriers and divides we have, either in our legislation or in our way of consuming information, is absolutely electrifying. And I think, Ian Warne, I'm absolutely in awe of your fluency in technology and your ability to actually not just understand it, put it into practice is just incredible. And I just think we need to download your brain to everyone in the room to see if we can sort of capture that knowledge. I've got 3 sons. I bore them witless about history and heritage, but every now and again you figure out, you've got to actually deliver it to them in a way that they can consume it. And I did my Mother's Day duty yesterday and went and saw my mother, who was lamenting the fact that her nieces in London don't respond to her letters. She used to send them longhand letters. And I said, well, look, they saw the letters as sort of like, it was getting the letter that was really fun because they'd never seen anything like it, this artefact from the 19th century virtually. My mother sort of realised that and sort of graduated to email. So she now emails them on her iPad, but they still don't respond. And I said, well, because you're talking long form, you've just got to send them a funny photo of a cat or just a quip about something or just a quick observation, and you'll get a response instantly. But writing a long form email and expecting them to sit down and write one back like it's an exam at their university, they're not going to do it. So we've all got to kind of adapt to that reality. When I was a kid, I used to sit down religiously at 6 o'clock to watch Doctor Who on ABC. Nobody watches TV by appointment anymore. We've got to draw on all the technology we've seen today to be able to sort of deliver information in a way that people are able to consume and willing to consume. And I think there's actually interest there. I think young people are actually genuinely interested in the past. They're interested in Aboriginal stories. They're interested in what Perth used to look like. All of those things, if we can present them in these creative ways. So that's where we're kind of focusing our minds, even though our Act doesn't strictly, tell us that's what we should be spending a lot of time on. I also wanted just to let you know, or let you in on a little secret. So, 2029 is coming. 2029 is just, look, it's an excuse for a good party. And in WA, we don't need much of an excuse. There's nothing that magic about 2029 in reality. It's an arbitrary date. So it's the point at which the white shoe real estate developers landed in Perth in 1829. But it's not really the full story. It doesn't deal with the 80,000 years of Aboriginal history that we have. It doesn't deal with the French interaction, the Dutch interaction, the Chinese, the Indonesian, the American whalers. That is a much more interesting and rich story, and we need to de-emphasise a little the British colonial arrival in 1829, which makes no sense in Albany, which is 1826, so it's not even the state as a whole's kind of anniversary in that sense. It was just a moment in time, and we've got to draw out all those other stories. I've spent a bit of time looking at what happened in 1979 during the sesquicentennial celebrations, and I remember that as a kid. I remember the then Premier standing up and mangling in the name of the Miss Universe winner. That really stuck in my mind. And it was, redcoats galore, reenactments of redcoats and white frilly shirts and all that kind of thing. I mean, that's part of it, part of our history, we can't deny that, but it's a very small part of a longer, deeper and more interesting history. And I like to also think in our geological terms. We've got a very interesting geological history on the planet in planetary terms. Our biodiversity, our species are just extraordinary. We have more species in the Fitzgerald River National Park than in the entirety of the United Kingdom. So WA, this sort of arbitrary line on the map and the 1/3 of Australia that we happen to inhabit is so different. And if there's one thing West Australians actually like, it's kicking to death the eastern states. And I think that's a unifying story. That's a social cohesion story that we've got, an opportunity to say, look, we are really different. There were no Dutch, French, interactions with the East Coast in the same way that we had. I mean, our history is deeper, longer, and more interesting. And I think we should capitalise on that, capture that WA imagination about secession, get all that revived again. And I'll let you in on a little secret. The Heritage Council's going to be launching a new heritage plaque. I was warned when I became chair not to go near the topic of plaques because people would be clutching at their pearls and it would be a debate that would never end. We have decided to completely change our plaques, so those little boring brown rectangular ones will be not existing anymore. We're going to have a plaque that's a much more recognisable colour. It is going to have an Aboriginal motif to recognise that there's thousands of generations of Aboriginal habitation here. All places will reference the Aboriginal country that they're on. Just a subtle show of respect. And there'll be a QR code. And the point of the QR code is then we get away from the style of building being the sort of central point. We then start introducing oral histories and imagery and stories and all those other interesting things that are held by many of you and by state institutions. So it won't be just the Heritage Council's offerings, but we'll tap into all those other things going on across government and private collections to tell this amazing story of WA. So it's interesting to tourists, it's interesting to local residents, and they can find out about the next place that's worth visiting we've got to make it really easy and accessible. So that's what I dedicate the Heritage Council to doing, and I think all of you are doing amazing things in getting us to that place so that we, in 2029, have a great party. Thank you very much indeed.